And he had been hitchhiking around the country, had no prior criminal record, but he got hooked up with a teenager in the Dallas area, and because he ran out of gas, this teenager picked him up, and they decided they'd go to a drive-in movie together, drink some beer together, and then the teenager dropped him off at his hotel, and he went on the rest of that evening and killed a Dallas cop and framed Randall Adams and said that he did it. And the prosecutor in that case was a guy named Doug Mulder, who was known to have said in front of other prosecutors, any prosecutor can convict a guilty man. It takes a hell of a prosecutor to convict an innocent person. And the head of that office at the time was Henry Wade. Some of you remember Roe versus Wade, right? The abortion decision. Henry Wade was the head of that office. I later met a woman who resigned from that office because she said they would take evidence and throw it in the closet together and commingle evidence and not tag it properly. And the whole idea was just to convict people. It got so bad that the ABA's own magazine had a cover story which said, Dallas DA's office, a win at all costs. And so in that climate, Randall Adams was wrongfully convicted, was in prison for many, many years and spent several years on death row, was only saved by the Supreme Court giving a stay of execution, and finally was cleared from this offense. In fact, Randall told me that there was only one good day that he spent in Texas, and that was since he was from Columbus. All those Texas prisoners kept telling him how in the Cotton Bowl that year, Texas A&M was going to kick those northern boys from Ohio's butts. And Randall said, well, we'll just have to wait and see. And Ohio State kicked their butts. And so he said, I really got to rub it in. And that was the only good day I had in prison. So he got out, and like a lot of these other people who get wrongfully convicted, he had a lot of troubles adjusting. You know, we don't have too many good studies on this, but from interviewing a lot of these people, I know that they have trouble sometimes holding jobs. Their social relationships are strained. If they were married, a lot of times their marriages break up. You know, there's a recent study, there's a book that's going to come out pretty soon that I've been reviewing for Cambridge Press in England. There's a psychiatrist at Cambridge who's been interviewing some of these wrongfully convicted prisoners who got convicted in the Irish pub bombing scandals. Some of you saw the movie In the Name of the Father. And some people were convicted for IRA bombings of pubs in England, and the Guildford case, and there were a couple other cases where these people were convicted. Turned out it was a highly charged political atmosphere. They didn't do it. And Adrian Grounds, who's the psychiatrist writing this book, has been interviewing them. And what he's found is that he didn't expect to find a whole lot, because he said when he first looked at the literature on long-term incarceration, it didn't show a lot of particular psychological deterioration, which surprised him. But he said, I didn't think I'd find much. What he found was, in virtually every one of these cases, their symptoms corresponded with post-traumatic stress disorder. They had all kinds of anxiety, trouble sleeping, trouble settling down, trouble reintegrating with their families. Their wives described them as completely different people than they were before. And they were socially disrupted. You know, one guy said, you know, it was embarrassing. He said, my wife had to teach me things like how to use an ATM machine. Those were all new because he'd been in prison for a long time. When he went in, you know, the children were young. By the time he got out, a lot of these guys got out, their children were grown. They went in as young parents, came out as grandparents. So their lives are really disrupted. And the thing about prison sentences that I always tell my students at UC Irvine, which is farther than the Irvine here, I noticed on the freeway. There's a little closer. We give out these sentences to prison in the United States and everywhere else based on a linear conception of time. So you get convicted of some felony, let's say they sentence you to 10 years. But from my point of view, you know, the actual effect on your life is much greater than that, because change in our society is not linear. It's definitely curvilinear. Think about what happens in any given decade. Think what happened between 1993 and now. Lots of things happen. So if you're out of circulation, even if you have access to TV and radio and stuff like that, it's not the same as being out there in society and interacting with people in a more normal environment. So this can be very disruptive. One of the former inmates told Dr. Grounds that it was a lot like being a stroke victim, that he had to be taught everything all over again. So whenever we make a mistake, there's all that sort of thing that's going on. And we don't know exactly how many of these cases there are. I'm going to talk about that in a minute. But the important thing I've been trying to say for the past 15 years about this is that the public, when I first started talking about this in the 80s, a lot of people would say, oh, you know, this is just some liberal issue. And when we did our survey, we even had one judge write in and say, he apparently got his law degree from Ohio State. He said, I can't believe my old alma mater is wasting their time doing this research when all these guilty people are going free. Well, you can't say in a public forum that there's an inverse relationship between type 1 and type 2 errors. People's eyes glaze over if you put it that way. So what I started saying back in the 80s that finally caught on was, you know, this is not just a liberal issue. This is a public safety issue. Every time we get the wrong guy, the real offender's out there and may be visiting your family soon. So, you know, you mentioned Edward Jackson. Here's a guy who was wrongfully convicted of rape, as was mentioned, an African-American guy in Columbus, Ohio. Spent 5 years in the Ohio prison system. While he was there, his son got run over by a car. He was taken to Children's Hospital in shackles to visit his son. His son died, he never saw him again. Things like that happen when you're locked up. Now, a side issue on that story, which is not generally known publicly, but it's okay with the woman that I say this, so I'll say it. I was sitting in my office at Ohio State one day and I get a call from a woman named Deborah M. And again, she's public about this. And she said, you know, Dr. Huff, I'm in another department, but I want to do a dissertation and I'd like for you to be on my committee. And I said, well, what's the dissertation topic? She said, I want to study rape victims and look at who recovers from rape and who doesn't. And she said, you know, I think I've got a perfect sort of control built in here because there's this serial rapist and all but one of his victims were white and they all were about the same age and they all suffered similar degrees of trauma, which included, by the way, being choked until they were almost clinically dead and then revived by the rapist. Turned out he was an MD. So that was his thing about power over women, which, you know, that's what rape's really about. So she said to me, you know, would you be willing to do this? And I said, yeah, I think that's a fascinating topic and a very good idea. Later, she told me she was one of the rape victims. And she got her dissertation, later started a center for rape victims, and did a lot of good public education in this field in Columbus. So I know from talking to Deborah that she never thought she was picking out the wrong person when she identified William Jackson. And unlike some of the cases in our research, these two guys looked remarkably alike. They're both African American. They both had sort of short afros at that time. They were similar in height. We've had cases where they were the different ethnicities, different races, a foot different in height. And as I'll mention, the leading cause, if you just look at factors, the leading correlate of error is eyewitness error. But in this case, I mean, she was truly anguished when she found out she had picked out the wrong person. And by the way, her findings concluded that if by recovering from rape you mean going back to the way people were, she argued that no one ever really recovers in the sense of going back to what they were. They were all changed by it in some way. Some became totally angry toward males. And in fact, when she went to the Rape Crisis Center, when she was raped, she said the women who were working there wanted to tell her how this was just what males do. And so when she got done with her study, she tried to help the Rape Crisis Center select women who weren't there just for to take some political position about all males, because she said, well, all males don't do this. I came for help and you're giving me this sermon about how all these males are, you know, have the proclivity to do this.